Hello, boys and girls. Abraham Lincoln here, live and in stereo. No return engagements, no encores, and absolutely no requests. I hope you're ready, because I'm about to tell you the story of why. More specifically, why the Civil War happened. For a closer look at this, close your eyes and imagine being me, sitting at that podium alongside my rivals, and in the end, winning. Southern Democrats actually wanted their party to lose. This was an excuse for them to leave the Union. They believed that breaking away from the Union would be peaceful. Apparently, I posed a significant threat to the economical and political interests of the slaveholding South. Now that we look back on this, we can tell that I did a lot. My party and I wanted to abolish slavery. My opponents, mostly from the South, didn't because their plantation-based economy in the South relied on slavery for free labor. When I won, several southern states seceded so they could continue to have slavery be legal, and that started the Civil War. About a year into the war, the South was actually winning, so I issued the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves in all of the United States. This was irrelevant in the North, since they were free anyways, but the idea was that the proclamation would cause such turmoil in the South that the Confederate Army would be distracted by the civil unrest, and it worked. The North went on to win the war, and slavery became illegal throughout the entire country. Now picture the United States today without me. Hey, I'm back, and now I'm here to tell you about the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was an effort by Congress to get rid of sectional and political rivalries triggered by the request of Missouri late in 1819 for admission as a state, in which slavery would be permitted. At the time, the United States contained 22 states evenly divided between slave and free states. Now, how did this impact the American Civil War? Well, the Missouri Compromise was passed into law in 1820 and regulated slavery in the western states. Though it was passed 41 years before the war, it still played a large role in laying down the groundwork for the war that was to come. It contributed to the division and disagreement between North and South regarding the issue of slavery and made the issue more contentious between the two sides of the country. The Missouri Compromise forbade slavery in Louisiana and any territory that was once part of it in the Louisiana Purchase. Slavery was also forbidden anywhere north of the 3630 parallel, except within the territory of Missouri, where it was to be allowed. Now, why this is all so important? Well, it played a significant role in the relationship between the North and South in the time leading up to the American Civil War. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a compromise primarily focused on how slavery would be dealt with in the expanding United States. Think of it. If it wasn't for this compromise, you might not be sitting in this classroom, and although we don't have air conditioning right now, you might be under the hot sun plowing some fields. You choose. Hey, it's me again, and now I'm going to tell you all about the Compromise of 1850. Well, if you're wondering what it is, the Compromise of 1850 was a package of 5 separate bills passed by the United States Congress in September 1850, which diffused a 4-year political confrontation between slave and free states regarding the status of territories acquired during the Mexican-American War in 1846. As part of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was amended and the slave trade in Washington, D.C. was abolished. Furthermore, California entered the Union as a free state and territorial government was created in Utah. Now, how this led to the American Civil War? Well, the compromise prevented further territorial expansion of slavery while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, a law which compelled Northerners to seize and return escaped slaves to the South. And this most definitely was a significant event. Views from the North and South were polarized, but the Compromise of 1850 made them reach a temporary political equilibrium. It accomplished what it intended to achieve at the time, to revitalize the Union in peace. Most politicians knew that the compromise was a patchwork and that it was a temporary solution, at best delaying the inevitable Civil War. Guess who it is? It's me again. And now, I'm here with the Kansas and Nebraska Act. This act was passed by the U.S. Congress on May 30th, 1854. It allowed people in territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. The act served to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which prohibited slavery north of latitude 36 and 30. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 narrowly passed while congressmen brandished weapons and uttered death threats in the House House chambers overturned parts of the Missouri Compromise by allowing the settlers in two territories to determine whether or not to allow slavery by a popular vote. Pro and anti-slavery agitators all moved to Kansas, hoping to shift the decision by some numbers. The two factions struggled for 5 years with sporadic outbreaks of bloodshed that claimed 56 lives. Although both territories eventually ratified anti-slavery constitutions, the violence shocked and troubled the nation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed each territory to decide the issue of slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. Kansas with slavery would violate the Missouri Compromise, which had kept the Union from falling apart for the last 34 years. The long-standing compromise would have to be repealed. Ever heard of the Battle of Fort Sumter? Well, here I am again to tell you all about it. The Battle of Fort Sumter was a bombardment of Fort Sumter near Charleston, South Carolina, by the Confederate States Army, and the return, gunfire, and subsequent surrender by the United States Army that started the American Civil War. On April 12, 1861, Confederate warships turned back the supply convoy to Fort Sumter and opened a 34-hour bombardment on the stronghold. The Civil War was now underway, and the bells have rung for the commencement of the Civil War. On April 15th, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the Northern Army. Unwilling to contribute troops, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee dissolved their ties to the federal government. The impact of this battle was that it was the beginning of the Civil War. John Brown's Raid. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was an effort by armed abolitionist John Brown to initiate an armed slave revolt in 1859 by taking over a United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. The impact of this raid? John Brown cut his teeth as a killer as an anti-slavery jayhawker during Bleeding, Kansas. In mid-October of 1859, the crusading abolitionists organized a small band of white allies and free blacks and raided government arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hoped to seize weapons and distribute them to Southern slaves in order to spark a racking series of slave uprisings. Although Brown captured the arsenal, he was quickly surrounded and forced to surrender by soldiers under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. He was tried for treason and upon his execution became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. Southerners, on the other hand, began to militarize in preparation for future raids. This caused society to become alert quickly. John Brown's raid intensified the slavery debate to such an extent that it was practically impossible to resolve the slavery issue without bloodshed. Brown himself indicated as much in one of his last statements before he was hanged. I fear that the sins of this guilty land can only be purged with blood. I promise I won't be here for much longer, but just before I go, I'm going to tell you about the Dred Scott decision. Sanford, legal case in which the U.S. Supreme Court on March 6, 1857, ruled that a slave, Dred Scott, who had resided in a free state and territory where slavery was prohibited, was not thereby entitled to his freedom. The African American were not and could never be citizens of the United States. He was simply a Virginia slave who tried to sue for his freedom in court. The case eventually rose to the level of the Supreme Court, where the justices found that as a slave, Dred Scott was a piece of property that had none of the legal rights or recognitions afforded to a human being. The Dred Scott decision threatened to entirely recast the political landscape that had thus far managed to prevent civil war. The classification of slaves as mere property made the federal government's authority to regulate the institution much more ambiguous. Southerners renewed their challenges to the agreed-upon territorial limitations on slavery, and polarization intensified. Now, how is this significant? On this day, in 1857, the United States Supreme Court issues a decision in the Dred Scott case, affirming the right of slave owners to take their slaves into Western territories, thereby negating the doctrine of popular sovereignty and severely undermining the platform of the newly created Republican Party. How would you feel if you were in his shoes?